It's 1943, the height of World War II, and while every other soldier is clutching their rifle and praying the bullets hold out, there's one absolute madman charging into battle with a Scottish broadsword strapped to his side, a longbow slung over his shoulder, and bagpipes wailing as he leads his men into combat. This isn't some fever dream or a scene from a fantasy novel. This is the true story of Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, better known as Mad Jack Churchill, the most gloriously insane warrior to ever set foot on a 20th century battlefield. Now, before we dive into the chaos that was Jack Churchill's military career, you need to understand something fundamental about this man. He wasn't crazy in the clinical sense. He was crazy in that uniquely British way where someone looks at the modern world, decides it's far too boring, and simply refuses to participate in its conventions. Born in 1906 in British-controlled Ceylon, which we now call Sri Lanka, Jack grew up in a military family. His father had served in the British Indian Army, so the martial life was in his blood. But where most military men of his era embraced the industrialized efficiency of modern warfare, Jack took one look at machine guns and tanks and thought, "You know what? I miss the good old days when men fought with honor, steel, and a healthy dose of theatrical flair." Before the war turned his eccentricities into legend, Jack had already lived several lifetimes' worth of adventure. He attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, served briefly in Burma with the Manchester Regiment, but found peacetime military service insufferably dull. So what did he do? He left the army to become a male model and a movie extra in Hollywood. Yes, you read that right. The man who would later terrify Nazi soldiers was once posing for advertisements and appearing in films. He also became an accomplished bagpiper, representing England at the World Pipe Band Championships in Glasgow in 1938. He rode motorcycles, learned to surf in Africa, and worked as a newspaper editor. Jack Churchill didn't just live life, he devoured it whole and asked for seconds. When Hitler decided to ruin everyone's plans by invading Poland in 1939, Jack was actually delighted. Finally, a proper war, a chance to do something interesting. He immediately rejoined the army and volunteered for commando duty, which was essentially the military equivalent of saying, "Please send me on the most dangerous, half-baked missions you can think of." The commandos were Britain's elite special forces, tasked with conducting raids, sabotage operations, and generally making life miserable for the Germans wherever they could reach. For Jack, it was the perfect playground. His first recorded kill with a longbow came during a raid in France in 1940. Let that sink in for a moment. While the world had moved on to semi-automatic weapons, artillery that could level entire buildings, and tanks that could crush anything in their path, Jack Churchill killed a German soldier with a weapon that had been cutting-edge technology during the 100 Years' War. According to reports, he and his commando unit were ambushing a German patrol when Jack drew his bow, took careful aim, and sent an arrow straight through an enemy sergeant at 30 yards. The rest of the patrol, presumably thinking they were under attack by a time-traveling medieval army, quickly surrendered. It's believed to be the only confirmed longbow kill by a British soldier during the entire war. But Jack wasn't content with just one anachronistic weapon. Oh no, he needed a full medieval arsenal. His signature Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore, became as much a part of his uniform as his boots. He didn't just carry it for show either. During the raid on the German garrison at Vagsø in Norway in 1941, Jack reportedly leaped off the landing craft onto the beach, broadsword raised high, bagpipes screaming, and charged the stunned German defenders. His commanding officers didn't know whether to court-martial him or give him a medal. They settled on the latter, and Jack received the Military Cross for his actions that day. The citation might have been more traditional, but everyone who was there knew the truth. They just witnessed a Scotsman from another century tear through German positions like he was auditioning for Braveheart. Jack had a philosophy about his weapons, and it was beautifully simple. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. He also famously stated that a man without a sense of humor is like a wagon without springs, jolted by every pebble on the road. This combination of deadly seriousness about proper military deportment and absolute whimsy about what constituted proper made him both beloved by his men and utterly baffling to anyone trying to write standard operating procedures. The bagpipes, though. We need to talk about the bagpipes. Jack didn't just play them before battle or during celebrations. He played them during battle, while under fire, as bullets zipped past his head and explosions rocked the ground beneath his feet. During that same Vagsor raid, as his commando unit fought through the Norwegian town, Jack stood on the beach playing The March of the Cameron Men on his pipes while coordinating the withdrawal of his forces. Imagine being a German soldier, wounded and shell-shocked, hearing the unholy wail of bagpipes cutting through the gunfire and explosions. You'd think either you were dying and entering some strange warrior's Valhalla, or the British had finally gone completely around the bend. Both assumptions would be partially correct. His most famous exploit came in 1943 during the invasion of Sicily. Jack was commanding a commando unit tasked with capturing a German observation post. The position was heavily defended and situated in the town of Molina, with machine gun nests, fortified positions, and dozens of enemy soldiers. A sensible officer would have called for artillery support, coordinated with armor units, and planned a careful assault minimizing casualties. Jack Churchill walked up to the position more or less alone, armed with his broadsword and supported by a single corporal, and captured 42 German soldiers along with a mortar team. How did he pull this off? By being so brazenly confident and utterly terrifying that the Germans couldn't quite process what they were seeing. According to accounts, Jack and his corporal moved through the darkened town, Jack's sword drawn, moving with the quiet efficiency of a predator. When they encountered the first German position, Jack didn't open fire. Instead, he used a combination of surprise, aggression, and the sheer psychological impact of a sword-wielding maniac emerging from the darkness to convince the Germans that they were surrounded by a much larger force. He herded them together, kept them convinced that resistance was futile, and marched them back to British lines. The Germans later reported that they'd been captured by an entire company of commandos. Nope, just one eccentric Brit with medieval weaponry and unshakable confidence. For this action, Jack was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The official citation was, as usual, rather dry and didn't mention that he'd essentially role-played his way through capturing an entire enemy position. But everyone who served with him knew the truth. Mad Jack didn't fight World War II like a 20th century soldier. He fought it like a Highland warrior who'd been inconveniently born several centuries too late, and was determined to make the best of it. His luck, however, couldn't hold forever. In 1944, Jack was commanding commando forces in Yugoslavia, supporting Tito's partisans against the Germans. During a raid on the island of Brac, Jack's unit was ambushed. In the fierce fighting that followed, most of his men were killed, and Jack himself was wounded by shrapnel. But even injured, he continued fighting, organizing the survivors and playing his bagpipes to keep their spirits up. Eventually, though, the position was overrun, and Jack was captured by the Germans. Now, being captured would be the end of the story for most soldiers. A prisoner of war camp, sitting out the rest of the war, maybe digging a tunnel if you were particularly ambitious. But Jack Churchill wasn't most soldiers. He was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most notorious Nazi facilities. The conditions were horrific, and escape seemed impossible. Jack took this as a personal challenge. He and a Royal Air Force officer managed to escape through a drainage ditch, making their way toward the Baltic coast with vague plans of stealing a boat and sailing to Sweden. They were recaptured near the coast, but rather than being executed as escaped prisoners, Jack was inexplicably transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Austria called Market Pongau. The Germans seemed genuinely confused about what to do with him. His file must have been fascinating reading. Captured British commando officer, fights with swords and bows, plays bagpipes under fire, has escaped once already. Do you execute someone like that, or do you just put him somewhere secure and hope he doesn't break reality itself? Jack naturally escaped again. In September 1944, he slipped out of the camp during a power outage and started walking. Not to the nearest Allied lines, which would have been sensible, but through the Alps toward Italy. He walked for 8 days, covering over 150 miles on foot through some of Europe's most challenging terrain. When he finally encountered American forces in Italy, the Americans initially thought he was a German trying to infiltrate their lines. After all, what kind of British officer wanders alone through the Alps looking like he just finished a particularly aggressive hiking holiday? By the time Jack rejoined British forces, the war in Europe was essentially over. He was devastated. According to his own account, he complained bitterly that, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. This quote perfectly encapsulates Mad Jack Churchill. While everyone else was celebrating the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history, Jack was mourning the loss of his favorite hobby. The man didn't just enjoy war, he absolutely loved it, provided it was fought with the proper sense of drama and style. But Jack wasn't done yet. When he learned that the war against Japan was still ongoing, he immediately volunteered for transfer to Burma. He wanted to get into that fight before it ended too. However, by the time he arrived in India and was preparing to join the campaign, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. Jack's reaction to learning about the atomic bombs was reportedly pure frustration. Peace had broken out before he could get back into action. After the war, Jack served in Palestine during the British Mandate, where he reportedly saved the lives of several Jewish prisoners by personally driving them to safety when their convoy came under attack. He later worked as an instructor at a land air warfare school in Australia, where he terrified a generation of Australian soldiers with his unorthodox methods and absolute insistence on maintaining proper military bearing even while doing completely insane things. He also, because of course he did, became an accomplished surfer in his later years. In the 1950s, he was one of the first people to ride the tidal bore on the River Severn in England, navigating the wave on a surfboard for miles inland. He took up sailing, motorcycling continued to be a passion, and he purchased a series of increasingly elaborate steam locomotives and railway equipment for his personal collection. The man simply could not sit still. Mad Jack Churchill retired from the military in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and spent his remaining years living in Surrey with his wife and 2 sons. He passed away in 1996 at the age of 89, having lived long enough to see the Cold War end and the world transform yet again. Right up until his death, he maintained that modern warfare had lost its sense of honor and drama, and that soldiers should always carry swords. Looking back at his career, it's almost impossible to believe that Jack Churchill was a real person. In any sane military, he would have been court-martialed dozens of times or at least confined to desk duty where his eccentricities couldn't get anyone killed. But Jack operated during a time when Britain needed heroes, needed men who were willing to take insane risks, and needed leaders who could inspire their troops through sheer force of personality and absolute fearlessness. The commandos were full of hard men, but even among them, Jack stood out as something special. Something touched by madness, perhaps, but also touched by genius. His legacy isn't just about the weapons he carried or the outrageous things he did. It's about the spirit he represented. In an age of industrial warfare, when individual heroism seemed obsolete and soldiers were increasingly just cogs in a massive military machine, Jack Churchill proved that personality still mattered. That courage, style, and sheer bloody-minded determination could still turn the tide of a battle. He showed that even in the most mechanized, depersonalized war in human history, one man with enough audacity could become a legend. The American soldiers who encountered him thought he was insane. The Germans who faced him thought he was terrifying. The British soldiers who served under him thought he was the finest officer they'd ever known. All of them were right. Jack Churchill was a walking contradiction, a man out of time who somehow became exactly what his time needed. He fought World War II as if it were the 100 Years' War, brought bagpipes to gunfights, charged machine guns with a sword, and not only survived but thrived. In our modern age of drones, precision-guided missiles, and warfare conducted from air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles from the battlefield, Mad Jack Churchill seems even more impossible than he did during his own lifetime. We've optimized war down to cold mathematical precision, eliminating the human element wherever possible. Jack represents something we've lost, for better or worse. The idea that war could be personal, that combat could have honor, that there was room for individual glory even in industrial-scale slaughter. Whether that's something worth mourning is a question each person must answer for themselves. But there's no question that Jack Churchill was one of a kind. The British Army never produced another soldier quite like him, and probably never will. He was the last warrior, the final echo of an age when men fought with steel and nerve rather than technology and tactics. He brought a longbow to World War II and somehow made it work. He played bagpipes while under fire and used the psychological impact as a weapon. He captured dozens of enemy soldiers with nothing but a sword and sheer confidence. He escaped from Nazi concentration camps twice and walked through the Alps like he was out for a country stroll. Mad Jack Churchill proved that even in the deadliest war humanity had ever known, there was still room for one absolutely mad British officer with a sword, a bow, bagpipes, and an unshakable belief that modern warfare was just too damn boring. And for that, history will always remember him as the warrior who brought the Middle Ages to World War II and somehow came out the other side covered in medals and glory, ready for the next adventure. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is indeed improperly dressed, and Jack Churchill made damn sure he was always dressed to kill.